Hello there, welcome to my review of the 1974 film The Taking of Pelham 123. Directed by Joseph Sargent and written by Peter Stone, based on the novel by John Gotti, it has a sensational ensemble cast of Walter Matthau, Robert Shaw, Martin Balsam, Hector Elizondo and Jerry Stiller. The budget was $3.8 million and it was a reasonable success, making $18.7 million at the box office. For reference, Robert Shaw made Jaws a year later, which cost $9 million and made $472 million, although that is an extreme case as it basically invented the blockbuster. But only one of these has a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's not the one with the shark. The reason for the perfect critic rating is that it is an incredible film. It's set in New York and was made at a time before big cities got wise to how lucrative filming could be for them, so the film has amazing access to the city. It's also a New York that largely doesn't exist anymore, for both good and bad reasons. So it acts as a snapshot of that city at that time, which I think is a really important feature of any film shot on location. I wish more footage existed of the places I grew up in, and one of the huge positives of everyone carrying a camera in their pocket these days is that there is an opportunity to document the here and now. I get a thrill from seeing New York in the mid-70s, and I've never visited. If you're a New Yorker, this must be as close you get to time travel. The plot is a tightly scripted, incredibly tense thriller that captures the very best of 70s filmmaking. The technology was good enough that it didn't have to be filmed on a soundstage like earlier movies had to, but it also doesn't suffer from the escalation of spectacle that we see in later action movies, where something has to blow up at least 2 or 3 times over the course of the film. Hitchcock had a very famous quote about the difference between suspense and surprise, where surprise is sitting around a table chatting when a bomb goes off, and suspense is the same situation, but the audience know that the bomb is there and is due to go off at 1 o'clock, and there's a clock on the wall that says it's 1:45. The first gives you 15 seconds of surprise, and the second 15 minutes of suspense. Well, Pelham is 1 hour and 45 minutes of suspense. The way the film achieves this is through several different tricks and techniques that we either rarely see in film today or have become cliches. Matthau is their hero, and every man who doesn't become an indestructible superhero type by the film's climax, after having gone through a series of ever more improbable scrapes, he remains a normal, if not exceedingly quick-witted, everyman. You could argue that he lacks a character arc, or at least doesn't have a particularly big arc, but the secret is characters don't always have to have a character arc if the story doesn't require it. I'd much prefer to have a character to have no arc than to have one inserted that doesn't feel organic or isn't fully realised, something artificially tacked on purely for the purposes of giving the character a story arc. The whole point of his character is that this is his job, and he's just going to do it, regardless of the obstacles he has to overcome. The entertainment comes from watching him overcome all the obstacles.
Well, the guy who's talking's got a heavy English accent. He could be a fruitcake. We got anybody at 28th Street?
Yeah, he's around there somewhere.
Right, well, tell him to hold the fort. His line will be all day before the city cops show up. They're never around when you need them.
Shaw is our villain, and he's not really given a character arc, but we certainly learn more about his character as the film goes on, because we can't just see him as the villain, or we wouldn't want to spend as much time with him as we do.
Listen, trainmaster. Your locomotive has been hijacked by a group of heavily armed men. It what?
While Die Hard might be at the more escalating spectacle end of action thrillers, it's still understood that you have to have a villain that the audience enjoys spending time with, and, up to a point, can kind of root for.
Nice suit. John Phillips, London. I have two myself.
Without giving anything away, this film would be as good whether the villains succeed or failed in their plan. Before I do get into spoiler territory, I also want to mention how good the score is. It's got a thumping 1970s brass-led theme that really sets the tone, somewhere between jazz and orchestral, that perfectly sets the mood as to what type of film this is. It's an action film, and the score is suitably dynamic. Now, on to spoilers, so if you haven't seen the film, please do go and watch it before watching any more of my video. After the opening credits, it opens on a New York street, and we're quickly introduced to our first villain, Green, played by Balsam. The four villains are all referred to by colours so as not to give away their names during their scheme, an idea that Quentin Tarantino would later borrow for Reservoir Dogs. He's not immediately obvious as a bad guy, although I think the filmmakers could have perhaps disguised it better had they not had him carry a suspiciously sized brown box around with him. Maybe it's because this has become a bit of a cliche, but it did stand out for me. We then get some scene-setting local colour from two train conductors as Green boards the subway and sits without incident. We stay with the conductors as another similarly dressed man boards the same subway car. This is Gray, played by Elizondo, who makes a perverted gesture to a young woman on the train. Next is Brown, played by Earl Hindman, who is perhaps best known for only showing the top half of his head as Wilson on Home Improvement. He unapologetically bumps into one of our conductors as he boards the train, and that conductor leaves. Finally, we're introduced to Shaw's Blue as he waits for the train, nervously shuffling from side to side and checking his watch. All four men are dressed the same, with hats colour-coded to their nicknames, thick-rimmed glasses, moustaches, and long reversible raincoats, although Green has his on the other way round to the rest of the gang. This is a really simple way of introducing that these four are connected to each other, but are distinct and different in their personalities, and as the film goes on, this is made more and more explicit as more of their characters are revealed to us. As the train stops at Blue's station, he approaches the driver and pulls a gun on him, telling him he is taking the train, the Pelham, which confuses the driver as no one steals a subway train. The rest of the men also act deliberately and quietly. Green is the only one who knows how to drive the train, Gray and Brown are crowd control, and the plot is then off and running. Except it's not, as it grinds to a halt on the dozing face of Mattau's Lieutenant Garber, who is then introduced to a group of visiting subway staff from Tokyo. They provide some comic relief with Garber, as it's not entirely clear how much English they understand.
Don't worry about a thing, they don't understand a word of English. This way, dummies. Just step this way, dummies.
While he gives them a tour he seems to have given numerous times before.
Johnny, would you take these monkeys up to 13?
It is all right, Lieutenant Garber. I'm sure we can find it by ourselves.
As well as comic relief, it's also a brilliant expository tool that guides us around all of the unfamiliar workings of a city subway network, telling us what everything is as he tells them, It also introduces characters, such as Stiller's Lieutenant Rico Patrone.
Why don't you tell these gentlemen about some of the exciting things that have happened in the New York City subway system lately, Rico?
Well, we had a bomb scare in the Bronx yesterday. But it turned out to be a cantaloupe.
Apparently typecast as an Italian long before playing George Costanza's father.
You're supposed to see a face in there. Do you see your face in there?
It's such a common mistake in screenwriting to have characters telling the audience something that we don't know by having a character tell another character something that they should already know. I'm quite surprised that it still happens so often as it does when this film had cracked that nearly 50 years ago. It's so simple and yet so effective to do it in this way when setting the scene. The exposition occurs like this throughout the film. With Green being the only one who knows about trains, it allows him to explain certain details to us that the rest of the gang also don't know. And Garber explaining to characters who don't work on the subways what is going on for our benefit. Introducing a layman into a script should really be a lesson for all wannabe screenwriters. Another absolute treat this film gives us is a whole plethora of real feeling characters who come in for a single scene or two and then go again, maybe cropping up later in the film.
Whose goddamn wedding ring was it?
Who else? Mrs. Jenkins. But Kaz, you don't
Sorry
know what
about that,
the problem
Mr.
is.
Dolowitz. It just slipped off.
What were you doing with your hand in it, John, anyway?
The surly, sweary, loud subway workers who again provide colour and exposition, which contrasts neatly with the villains who purposely give away very little of what they're doing to increase the suspense until they're ready to do so. Even the passengers on the train are given a great deal of character, considering the small amount of screen time they have, just with a few costume choices or simple character traits, something that James Cameron would use to great effect in Aliens, but again something a lot of screenwriters seem blissfully unaware of. It's not long before the plot is revealed, and it's brilliant in its simplicity. The villains are simply holding the train car and its passengers hostage, and that's it. The plot is then sustained through a series of events that could lead to their capture, or their escape, or the continuation of the standoff. As the film goes on, we discover a little bit more about our villains. Grey is a really nasty piece of work, described by Blue as being dangerous and possibly mad, which is why he was thrown out of the Mafia. We are shown how dangerous he is by giving him the first kill of one of the surly subway staff who, thanks to the way he's written, I actually cared about. Blue is an incredibly precise and calculating ex-soldier, with every step of his scheme plotted out. He's ruthless, but incredibly intelligent. Brown is basically a heavy who will happily kill someone if ordered to do so, but doesn't enjoy it like Grey seems to. Green remains quiet, mild-mannered, and almost there against his will, as an ex-subway driver fired for misconduct, desperate for money. He also seems to be suffering with the same cold the mayor is struggling with. The mayor is brought in as he has to decide what to do about paying the ransom, and he's the sort of spineless vote chaser that has now become commonplace in portrayals of politicians, while his deputy is actually the one who does all the work. Thanks to the casting of some top-notch character actors and dialogue that allows almost every character to have a moment, they're all really clearly defined. So much so, it's almost a magic trick. The stars of the show remain Matto and Shaw as they match wits almost exclusively via radio. It would be tempting to have them meet face to face halfway through the film, as it seems you have to do in modern cinema, but the decision to keep them apart would have been such a simple one when the film was made, and it doesn't detract in any way from the film. Another now cliched way they create tension is by having the whole situation play out against the clock. Blue has given them a deadline that they have to deliver the money by, and he's quite insistent about it. Based on how he's been characterised, we know he means to stick to this. And as we do care about the hostage, it matters. A mistake some films make in order to create tension is to add a countdown where one isn't necessary, and it always feels false. But that's not the case here. It's entirely warranted by the situation. At each stage, every part of the plot works in perfect harmony. I should say that it's not the case every modern action film or thriller gets it wrong. There have been lots of great action films made since, but there have also been a lot of bad ones that are bad because they make simple mistakes that they could easily have avoided had they paid more attention to this film and took notes. I have to assume that the writers of the first 3 Die Hard films were fans of this film based on some of the similarities, but the writers of the last 2 Die Hard films were not. Make of that what you will. At just about the halfway point of this film, something really interesting happens as the film shifts gears. As the money is about to be delivered, some unidentified SWAT officer hidden in the subway takes a shot at the train, and the hijackers retaliate by killing the train conductor who we met at the beginning. Instantly, we lose any affection we had for Blue, but also the film is no longer about the hijacking, but is now an escape film. Shortly afterwards, the crooks get the money, and it's up to Massow's character to work out how they plan to escape. The train is on the move now, and with some neat exposition, a city cop asks Garber what happens if they got off the train and left it running as a diversion, which he explains can't happen because of a dead man's switch.
The handle has to have a man's hand pressing down on it hard at all times. Otherwise, the thing don't work. The train stops cold.
At this point, they are still indeed on the train, but shortly stop the train and start rigging it with what we now can assume is something to turn off the dead man switch. This is all set up in such a way that by the time we figured it out, it's already underway, and it's one of several plot points rather than the cornerstone of the whole finale, so it's very satisfying to watch. The film now diverges into the villains escaping, the train full of passengers hurtling out of control around the track, and Garber trying to figure out what the hell's going on. As the villains make their escape, an undercover cop who had remained incognito amongst the hostages the whole time reveals himself and pursues the crooks as they're about to exit the tunnels via the maintenance steps. Blue shoots Grey for endangering their escape, while Brown is shot by the cop. Green gets away while Blue goes to kill the cop. Before he can do so, Garber arrives.
Excuse me, fellow, would you mind dropping that gun and turning around, please? Drop it!
And so Blue decides to kill himself by touching his foot to the electrified third rail. In many ways, this would be seen as an anticlimax, as Garber isn't responsible for the deaths of any of the 3 criminals who get killed here. He's supposed to be the hero after all. But honestly, I much prefer this to having the protagonist be the only one with any agency in the story. I'm pretty tired of seeing everyone but the hero be incompetent or unable to catch the villains. So for me, this is incredibly refreshing. Everyone is just doing their jobs properly. The out-of-control train, while tense, pretty much resolves itself as it eventually hits a red light which engages the automatic braking system. Even though it remains unclear right up until it happens whether this will happen or not. Again, it didn't require the hero to come and save the day, and yet remains tense and thrilling, and ultimately satisfying in its resolution. It's finally revealed who the three dead men were, as up to this point there wasn't even an attempt to discover their real identities, because it didn't matter. Garber knows it was the fourth man who escaped who drove the train, as none of the others that they've identified have any train driving experience, and so checks with Lieutenant Rico for drivers who have been fired from the New York subway system, and he's left with 9 names of people still remaining in the city as possible suspects. They eventually get to Green, who hides the $500,000 he's ended up with in his oven as he's questioned by them. He covers for himself incredibly well, considering how nervous he appears. And this is really a testament to Balsam's performance, playing these different emotions all at once. They're convinced by his story, and Rico and Garber are out of the apartment when we are treated to one of the best endings in cinematic history.
Sorry if we bothered you, Mr. Longman.
Sorry, Rico. Gesundheit.
Garber quickly realizes he heard that sneeze before, as we are left with just one simple shot of Matteo's face that says everything. If a picture paints 1,000 words, this one frame of celluloid is a novel. The perfect ending to a flawless film. Honestly, I have no real criticism to make. By modern standards, there is a racial slur used, the worst one, but it's said by Gray, the most despicable character, and it's used to show how despicable he is. There is some mild misogyny, but it entirely reflects attitudes at the time, and is pretty forgivable. The cast is diverse and an accurate reflection of a multicultural, diverse New York of the 1970s, with people of different ethnicities in a variety of roles. There aren't a huge number of women in the cast, but thanks to how well everyone is given some sort of character development, they're all as well developed as the majority of the male characters. That's about as close to a negative as I can get, and honestly, it still has far better female characters than in the 2009 remake, which also disappointingly seems to fall into every action movie cliche that I highlighted this original version of the film manages to avoid. I would urge you, if you're a fan of cinema, to seek this film out. It's an absolute masterclass in how to tell a story, how to write characters, and how to write plot points. There's no wasted effort in any of it, and it brings together a fully realised universe that the film sits in, much more so than quite a lot of other films. I would definitely recommend this film. Thank you. Goodbye.